Welcome. Today we are going to talk about the philosophy and life of Epicurus, whose main question was, do you want to be happy? What's standing in your way? This very practical concern for philosophy really challenged the furthering reputations of Plato and Aristotle, and soon was one of those dominant forms of expression of philosophical life that survived and thrived because it was a philosophy of life. It wasn't just about ideas, but how do these ideas affect you? Unfortunately, Epicurus and Epicureanism and hedonism, the school of thoughts which followed after him, grew to take on a more negative connotation. Largely by the 3rd and 4th century, these are going to kind of wane and kind of get distorted in our minds of what we're thinking about, of only lavish food and drinks. But during the life and basic philosophy of Epicurus, as we'll address here in a moment, the idea wasn't so much about gluttony, but about understanding what it is to actually be happy. If we want to understand Epicurean, the philosophical movement, we really need to understand Epicurus, the man. He was born in 341 BC, 7 years after Plato's death, and will die in 270 BC in Athens. His family were Athenians, but he was likely born in Samos, a Athenian colony, only able to return to Athens after Alexander the Great died and Perdiccas expelled the Athenians from Samos. At this point, Epicurus was probably around the 18 years of age. He'll begin studying philosophy around the age of 14, largely because he was contemptuous of his teacher's poor ability to interpret texts. He was wiser than his teachers, or at least he thought he was at this time. At the age of 32, he will found his first school of philosophy in Mytilene and Lampicus. About 5 years later, he'll move to Athens and gather followers there until his death at the age of 72. He'll die of kidney stones, and the story goes that he gathered his friends around, drank some strong wine in a warm bath, and died after excruciating pain for about 2 weeks. Kidney stones is a very painful ailment. And when it passes, it could feel good, but sometimes it doesn't always pass and can result in death. Reading between the lines about him drinking strong wine and dying in a warm bath, we'll probably want to read that he took his own life, that he opened a vein in that bath and would bleed out in that bath, as that would help him to die soon and quick and relatively painless. Although that's not confirmed, reading between the lines, that's likely what happened. Epicurus, as the man, was known for his unparalleled benevolence towards all. He was honored with bronze statues and said to have had so many friends that the city could not contain them. So he was a well-liked individual, known for the kindness towards his brothers and the house slaves, who he even taught philosophy to. Now, today, we would see the idea of having slaves to generally be a morally repugnant idea, but that wasn't the case during Epicurus's life, and the fact that he taught philosophy to them meant that he saw them as closer to being equals than many of the others would have in his time. He was also described as rather pious and patriotic, though he did not engage in politics, and as a distrust of politics, he tried to avoid notions of division, which he saw as inherent in any political endeavor. The same reason why he opposed putting his money in a common account with his friends as Pythagoras and other philosophers did, because he believed that it would cause envy and mistrust and ruin relationships and friendships. He also didn't travel much beyond his early days of life. Once he settled in Athens and had his school opened up, he pretty much stayed there. The school in Athens grew out of his estate, which was outside of the city walls and was known as the Garden, because it met in his garden. Go figure, right? He spent most of his time in his garden eating a modest amount of plain food drinking a half a pint of cheap wine and water. And his luxury that he would occasionally indulge in was a small pot of cheese. So this is far from the basic idea that we think of initially with Epicureanism of fancy food, fancy drink, and luxurious items. If most of the time he's drinking cheap wine, eating bread, and occasionally indulging in some cheese. Right? This is not lining up with some earlier impressions that you guys might originally have about what you would expect out of Epicureanism. The movement which will grow out of Epicurus starts with a very simple question. Do you want to be happy? Do you? This is actually a fairly serious question, although most of us will just reflexively say, yeah, duh. Well, if you do want to indeed be happy, what's standing in your way? What obstacles exist between you and being happy? Your happiness is entirely up to you. The fundamental obstacle to your happiness is your own anxiety, your own pushing back, your own self. If you're anxious over your health, you'll get sick. If you're anxious over your food, you will not be satisfied. If you're anxious over the next life, you're not going to live this one. The key to be happy are the four truths of Epicureanism, or the four-part cure, as it is known. The four-part cure are, at least in parts, things that you may accept today. The first of which is that there's no divine beings which threaten us. Now, this is one that you may accept or you may reject, but this is the first step in understanding Epicureanism, is essentially your life is your own. You're not in some sort of elaborate divine illusion. The second is kind of a continuation, that there is no next life. Or, broader speaking, if there is, you don't know anything about it. So why bother stressing about it? If you don't know about the next life, Epicurus and others will say, then why are you concerning yourself with what's going to happen next? Can you concern yourself with what's going to happen now? The third point is that what you actually need is easy to get. What do you actually need? What do you actually need? That list is fairly short. Food, not luxurious food, just basic food. You don't need lobster and a T-bone steak. You need water. You don't need fancy wine and champagne. Right? Just basic food, basic drink. You need shelter. How much shelter? Not much. 500 square feet is probably sufficient. You don't need a 4,000 square foot McMansion. Right? You need basic shelter. Some of you might have larger families and maybe need a little bit more space, but how much do you need? Versus how much would you like or want? Most of us say, well, I need more space because I got all my stuff. Where's all my stuff going to go? I need a bigger house. Well, do you need all that stuff? Probably not. You like that stuff, but you don't need it. And so that's part of the thoughts. You need to figure out how little you actually need and enjoy possessing that, knowing you will continue to possess it. Epicurus will also die of kidney failure and was in great pain. And this kind of leads us to that fourth point of the movement, is that what makes us suffer is easy to put up with. What's interesting is, right, he dies of great pain, but yet part of his movement is that what makes us suffer is easy to put up with. And he would continue this even during his death, which may have been, again, at his own hand, right? Death doesn't need to be worried about. While pain exists, you can choose to endure it or focus on what you have. He focused on his friends during this time of suffering, and therefore he can endure his suffering because he had his friends with him. Death is a big obstacle for most of us. It's something that we think about, or at least something we think we should think about. Epicurus says that you do not need to be worried about it. In fact, there's a statement for Epicureans that death is nothing to us. Death is nothing. This was often put on rings and on mirrors to encourage his followers not to worry about death. While you are alive, you're not dead. And when you're dead, you'll deal with what it is to be dead then. Therefore, there's no reason for you to concern yourself about being dead. And since most of us worry about the next life, to simply say death is nothing. Even though Epicurus was familiar with death, it was all around him. This wasn't as hidden as it is in the modern era, right? Most of you haven't been to that many funerals, if any. And if you've been to them, not all of you have had open caskets. Not all of you have touched the body of the person who's there and dead. You haven't seen death. You hear about death. Now, some of you, this doesn't apply to. But for our culture, we don't know death. We don't see death. Our food comes from the supermarket, not from the feedlots. We don't see the death of the food that we eat. We don't see the death of the friends that we have. Again, some of us do, but most of us don't. As a culture, we pretend death doesn't exist, but then death becomes everything. We're overly concerned about an illness we could catch that could kill us, or we're overly concerned with an idea that we are mortal, that we construct large systems to pretend that it's not the case. Increasingly, we might not even be religious to think about what's the next life, because we don't want to think about death. And yet, there are those who argue that we're a culture of death on top of that, so oddly, kind of a mix of both. We thrive on it and yet are fearful of it and also completely ignorant of it. But for Epicurus and the Greeks and later Romans who are adopting his system, they're very familiar with death. They saw death. They held the bodies of loved ones who died. They know death could come around at any moment and get them. Right? Pre-antibiotics, etc. Right? Oops, sorry, you got an infection. You're dead. So the idea is, yeah, you might die at any moment, but death is nothing. What do you need? You need to live this life. Your sufferings are easy to put up with. There's not some grand cosmic scheme to ruin you and destroy you. In his letter to Menoeceus, we read, "Let no one be slow to seek wisdom when he is young, nor weary in the search thereof when he is grown old." So the very first thing that we need to know is that we need wisdom. That we are to be lovers of wisdom. We are to be philosophers. For no age is too early or too late for the health of the soul. Right? Wisdom is what's going to give your soul health. You need to seek wisdom. And to say that the season for studying philosophy has not yet come, or that it is past and gone, is like saying that the season for happiness is not yet, or that it is now no more. Therefore, both old and young ought to seek wisdom. The former, in order that, as age has come over him, he may be young in good things because of the grace of what has been. And the later, in order that while he is young, he may at the same time be old, because he has no fear of the things which are to come. So we must exercise ourselves in the things which bring happiness, since, if that be present, we have everything, and if that is absent, that our actions are directed towards attaining it. So we need to start by being wise. This is going to be the health for our soul. The aim of the letter is to address health of the soul and its connection to wisdom. The health of the soul is equated with things that bring happiness. So really what we want is happiness. The health is acquired first through seeking wisdom or seeking philosophy. So we first need to become philosophers. Once again, what is philosophy? Philosophy is broken out with two words, philo and sophy. There's a division here, right? Before we can understand really what he's asking about, we need to understand this term. Sophy is wisdom. Philo, or philos, is one of those words for love. It's a brotherly love. Unlike eros, which is what can I get, and agape, what can I give, philos is a mutual relation. I give and I get. It's a middle term for love. And so this is what we need for philosophy. We want to give to philosophy, give to wisdom, and we get from it. We get from wisdom. We gain. We contribute and we gain in this same action. There are four basic teachings out of Epicurus which we can address today. The first is going to address the issue of God. For Epicurus, God or the gods is a self-evident truth, but yet it doesn't apply. Right? So we're going to agree, okay, there is indeed gods. He's not an atheist in that he denies the existence of God, but this system isn't dependent upon God or even connected to the notion of gods at all. He says that gods, by definition, are immortal and happy. But what does that mean? If most of us might even agree with this basic definition of God as a living being who's immortal and happy, but this doesn't mean what you might think that it means. It's not what you think. If there's a God who's immortal, that may or may not affect us. But the fact that God is happy means that God doesn't care about you. At least this is the argument that's being made here by Epicurus and others. Why would God be concerned about you if God is happy? You're miserable. Your life is miserable. You have pains. And therefore, the God can't be happy if indeed the God is concerned with every mortal being who suffers in this life. Therefore, for the God to be happy, the God has to be detached. God has to not care about humanity. Now notice this is very different than the idea of God being loving. We're not saying God is loving. In fact, many of you might say, but God cares for me. Well, if God's loving, then God can't always be happy. God has to occasionally weep. So you might disagree on this, but this is his basic understanding, is that the immortal God is happy and therefore isn't concerned with mortal men, which may help you out in some ways because God isn't going to care about you one way or the other. The gods are not going to curse you. They're not going to seek your destruction or your death or your ruin. Right? That's why there's no divine being that threatens us. That's why we get that first of those four truths, because the gods, well, they don't care about you. How could they? They're being happy, and you're not. The second teaching is on death. He states, accustom yourself to believe that death is nothing to us. For good and evil implies awareness, and death is the privation of all awareness. Therefore, a right understanding that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life enjoyable, not by adding to life an unlimited time, but by taking away the yearning after immortality. We need to live our lives seeking not just to prolong life, but to enjoy the time that we have. We don't want just a long quantity of life, but a large quality of life. You want your life to have meaning, or at least to be enjoyable. Death also now puts you on the clock. The power of death is that your decisions right now are important. But if you lived on forever, your decisions don't really matter because you can get to it later. Do you do this or you do that? Well, you can do it again later. The fact you're going to die means you need to do it now. Would your life have real value if you lived forever? The fact that you're going to die makes every moment matter, makes every decision matter, because it's limited in scope. The next thing that concerns most of us is the future, and so this is what the third teaching is addressing. He states that we must remember that the future is neither wholly ours nor wholly not ours. So that way we must neither count upon it as quite certain to come, nor despair of it as quite certain not to come. Right? Nothing in life is guaranteed. None of the future of life is guaranteed. You don't get to determine what will come or what you will have. You have a part in the future, and you belong to it, but it's not yours. And it's not yours either. And so, again, are we going to let our anxiety over the future mean we're not living in the present? Doesn't mean don't make plans, don't prepare, but don't worry and fret so much for what will that do to you. The root of these concerns, be it the future or death, or even the issue of God and what the gods care about, really comes down to a question of desires. And this is where he points his attention in the fourth teaching. Right? What is it that you desire? What is it that we should desire? Some things you want in life, but you have no reason to. What you really desire is happiness. What happiness really is, according to Epicurus, is freedom from pain and fear. This tranquility is both of the mind and of the body. If you want to avoid pain and fear, don't want things that either possessing could cause pain or fear, or lacking them because you want them will cause you pain and fear. Therefore, it would be best to not have them so you don't worry about the loss of them. But yet, many of us still want these things. Our desires are at odds with themselves. For Epicurus, pleasure is the alpha and omega of a happy life. When we are pained, pleasure then, and then only, do we feel the need for pleasure. For this reason, we call pleasure the alpha and omega of a happy life. Pleasure is our first and kindred good. It is the starting point of every choice and every aversion. And to it we come back inasmuch as we make feeling the rule by which we judge of every good thing. And since pleasure is our first and native good, for that reason we do not choose every pleasure whatever, but often pass over many pleasures with greater annoyance ensures from them. Right? We don't take every sort of pleasure because not every pleasure is really going to be pleasurable for you. You know that to live a pleasurable life, sometimes you have to say no to one and yes to another. You have to make choices. But it doesn't mean that that other thing is bad. It just means that it is not the best good. And so part of what we need to do to try to make sure we have a happy life is to know what's going to be the most pleasurable. So do you drink the Expensive wine, it's good, but will that ruin your taste for basic cheap wine? Maybe. Can you always afford the good wine? If not, maybe it's better to never drink it to begin with. At least this was part of what Epicurus was advocating for with his diet of cheap wine and basic bread. He was content. He was happy. He didn't think, oh, this is horrible. He thought, this is pleasurable. This is making my life happy. This is what things are. So what pleasures matter in life? Physical? That's an easy place to start. Things feel good. It's pleasurable. Therefore, that's good. Pain, physical pain, feels bad. Therefore, to avoid. So maybe we would start there. Some of us might add emotional pleasures. I'm happy. I like this. I'm sad. I don't. Spiritual. For some, this is more important than the others. You're willing to forego physical pleasure or even emotional pleasure sometimes for a spiritual gain or a spiritual reward. Psychological is also part of all of that, right? Making sure that your mind works and that you're content in your own mind. And maybe that's a part of both emotional, physical, and spiritual. Maybe it's a combination of all of these lead to a contented psychological well-being. But if it's psychological is the most important, as Freud and others would argue, does it matter if it's real or imagined experiences? Can it all be pretend? Can you be happy, pleasurable with fake experiences? Does it matter if someone tells you a great story about something that happened to them, but it never did? Or is it okay to tell those stories? What do we do with things like the news anchor, Brian Williams, who tells us that during the 2003 Iraq invasion, that there were rounds coming into the airframe of his Chinook helicopter, and he was forced down traveling while the invasion was going after it was hit by an RPG. None of that happened. It's all fake. He's telling these stories maybe for his own psychological need, but is that good for you? Are all pleasures equal? Is it okay if your pleasures detract from somebody else's? Should we rank physical pleasure as something high or low? Why? Why would one matter more or less than the other? Are short-term pleasures more beneficial than long ones? Does immediate gratification pay off? If it's spiritual pleasures that we want, is it more important that things happen immediately or not? Is it worth some pain of doing something to help some other spiritual or emotional or physical or even psychological benefit? Not all pains are equal, neither are all pleasures. There are some pleasures that only can exist because of pain, and some pleasures that only lead to pain. They're not all equal, and while pleasure might be seen as good to us, not all pleasure is worthy of choice and doing. Just as not all pain is an evil that needs to be eliminated and shunned. You can probably think of some bad pleasures, some guilty pleasures, some things that you do that are not good for you. And it doesn't lead to further pleasure. It usually only leads to pain, discomfort, irritability, something. And maybe it causes distrust in your emotional well-being or psychological well-being or spiritual or physical because you indulged in one pleasure over another. Similarly, there are good pains. Saying no to a bad event, a bad thing, is a pain because it might have seemed like fun, but you're saying no to it. Or the pain of lifting weights afterwards, right? That you are a little sore, but you know it's a good pain because your body is gaining strength. There's value in that. We can't always see pain as equal to evil and pleasure is always good. Even as an Epicurean who sees pleasure is the alpha and omega of life, because not all pains are equal, neither are all pleasures. That we have to measure one against the other, and that's how we need to judge these. Which one leads to more and which one leads to less. So it's not just the momentary indulgence, and that's why the classical ease of approach towards hedonism, the view that Stoics and others will put on it, doesn't fit within the broader philosophical system, because it doesn't actually work that way. Everything becomes a little more difficult if we're actually going to be a serious philosophical Epicurean, because we realize that pain and pleasure is not always intrinsic into the item that it is. It's not one thing automatically leads to this, that there's a lot more nuance involved. He states that pain flare gives as much pleasure to a costly diet when the pain of want has been removed, while bread and water confer the highest possible pleasure when they are brought about to hungry lips. If you're truly thirsty or truly hungry, a little bit of food and water, just basic bread and water, is the greatest thing ever. While if you're full and well fed, food, well, no, that's not fancy enough. I want something nicer, right? The amount of pleasure you get out of the same piece of bread differs depending on your condition. Pain can also make way to pleasure when the pain stops. Removing a heavy weight that one feels light and free, though they are normal, if not worse off than they were before the weight was being added. If you've got this giant weight on your shoulders, literally or metaphysically or whatever, that gets removed, it feels better. You might actually be worse than you were to begin with, but you feel great because that's off. Little bits of pleasure can be done just by removing the object that was causing pain. Does that mean that there's pleasure inherent in that? No, it's situational. It's based upon you and your needs and what you actually need and what's actually going to help you thrive. So what does this all mean? Where are we supposed to go with that? When we say that pleasure is, in the end, the aim, we do not mean pleasures of the prodigal or pleasures of sensuality, as we understood as they do for some through ignorance, prejudice, or willful misrepresentation. What we mean by pleasure is absence of the body and trouble in the soul. It is not an unbroken succession of drinking bouts and merrymaking, not sexual love, not the enjoyment of fish and other delicacies of a luxurious table which produce a pleasant life. This is not what we're looking after. We need pleasures that are going to remove pains, present and in the future. We need to find pleasures that don't disturb our soul. We need pleasures that are not derived from addiction, where you have to have it. But what if the only cost of adding to it is that you're addicted to what you like? Is that okay? Like coffee and caffeine? Generally speaking, they say the only real negative effect of caffeine is that your body wants caffeine. So as long as you get it, you're okay. In fact, there's benefits to that other end. So how's that going to work, right? Lots and lots of studies out there, but that's generally the result of that. Right? You drink as much coffee as you want, as long as it's not too much. All you're really going to want is more coffee. What about habits? Are habits good? Are they beneficial? What about the runner or the gym rat? Right? If you miss a day of running or lifting, you feel uncomfortable with yourself. Are these okay? It's strengthening your body in one way or the other. It's making you feel better overall, so it's got real value. But is this pleasurable then in this way? Maybe. You got to kind of evaluate some of this on your own. How do you know which pleasures disturb your soul and which ones are actually beneficial? The answer to this is sober reasoning searching out the grounds of every choice and avoidance, banishing those beliefs which the greatest disturbances take possession of our soul. We need sober reasoning. So what do we do with that? Prudence, he says, is more precious thing than all of the other virtues. A life of pleasure which is not also a life of prudence, honor, and justice will not lead to pleasure, honor, nor justice. We need to be prudent with our choices. We need to weigh them out, which takes, again, loving wisdom. You need to know which one is there. Now, the aim isn't just to be wise. The aim is to have a happy life, to be pleasurable. But you need to know through wisdom which actions are prudent and which ones are going to actually benefit you and your soul. In summary, Epicurus states, "Who then is superior in your judgment to such a person? He holds a holy belief concerning the gods, and is altogether free from the fear of death. He has dignity considered the end fixed by nature, and understands how easily the limit of good things can be reached and attained, and how either the duration or the intensity of evils is but slight. Exercise yourself in these and kindred precepts day and night, both by yourself and with him who is like you, that never either in waking or in dream will you be disturbed, but will live as a god among people." This is what Epicurus thinks is the result of his philosophy. Notice how this is very much a this world philosophy. He's addressing every issue of your life, at least broadly speaking. It's not just about what is the next life or anything like that, but what are you doing now? Evils are but slight. Fear of death doesn't exist. You know what you need and you're only getting those needs. Therefore, you're able to live above everybody else in this respect. Today we addressed Epicurus and his basic philosophical system. It's not what hedonism is usually painted as. It's a little bit more basic than that. And yet, in other ways, far more advanced. You need to have wisdom to know which pleasures are worth doing. But again, if you have that, your life will go well. And this, after all, is the aim of what Epicurus is after, is trying to be happy. Surrounding yourself with other people who are going to help you be happy. Having only what you need and not really looking for more than that. In fact, sometimes even shunning it because it might not be what's going to sit well within your soul. This is the basic philosophy of Epicurus, something that challenged and in many ways surpassed Aristotle for at least a few centuries. Hedonism gets a bad rap, but there's certain things that you could probably take from this philosophy, even if you're not going to become a philosophical hedonist.